Welcome to Worldbuilding Step 1, which is confusingly the third video in the practical world building series. I really gotta figure out a better way to number these things because even I'm confused at this point. In the series, we started with a blank page and are building a world for use as a Dungeons & Dragons campaign setting, all in the hope that you're following along and building a world of your own. In step 0, which is an optional step of my own design, and one that isn't in the Dungeon Master's Guide, we came up with our fantasy fundamental forces, all in order to give us a framework for our Pantheon and our Planar system. In this step, step 1, we will be creating our Pantheon, the deities within it, and taking a quick look at Planar systems and Cosmologies. But first, we need to define some terms. The DMG uses a lot of words in ways that I find confusing or ambiguous. Such is the territory when attempting to describe make-believe concepts in a systematic and not confusing way. So let's make sure we're all on the same page. Not all of this is vital to the construction of your Pantheon, but I think it's interesting, so we're going to talk about it. I'm going to use the word deity in this video quite a lot, often interchangeably with the terms god and goddess. When I say deity, I almost always mean greater deity. The DMG gives us 3 divine ranks, the third of which is divided further into 3 subcategories. At the top are the stars of this video, the greater deities. They don't have a physical body and exist in too many of the wrong dimensions for mortals to understand. In my campaign setting, I treat the greater deities as ideals incarnate. They can't change their mind about things because they don't have minds to change. They just exist. Almost like a song, you can harmonize with it, be dissonant to it, or ignore it completely. But you can't touch it or talk to it. So when I say god, goddess, or deity, this level, the greater deities, is almost always what I mean. Below the greater deities in divine rank are the lesser deities. The DMG defines these as deities which are embodied somewhere in the planes that can be encountered by mortals, which I take to mean that unlike their greater counterparts, lesser deities exist in more of the same dimensions as the mortals in your setting. The examples given in the DMG are Laru, Sakola, and Lulth. All of these examples are very closely associated with a single species, in this case unicorns, Sahuagin, and Drow, and are seldom worshipped by outsiders. Is the DMG trying to tell us something with this particular selection of examples? Maybe. I think it's more likely that these are just 3 of the best known lesser deities they could come up with. And, as usual, they are being intentionally ambiguous, allowing you to fill in the gaps with whatever makes sense to you. For example, I treat lesser deities completely differently in my campaign setting. Instead of more specialized deities with corporeal forms, they function as extensions of the greater deities. So if a mortal ever does any oath-taking, pact-swearing, or any other kind of mythical magic stuff, they're usually dealing with a lesser deity, serving as a proxy to a greater one. I'm not telling you this to tell you to do this. I just want it to be clear that at this level of the world building process, and frankly all levels of the world building process, you can take a lot of liberties. You should only follow along with a guide for as long as it's helpful, whether it's the Dungeon Master's Guide or one of my videos. As soon as you disagree with something or have a better idea, run with it. It's your world, so go wild. The third division of divine rank contains the quasi-deities. They are immensely powerful divine beings, but don't hear or answer prayers. So pretty much deities that don't have paladins or clerics. Among the quasi-deities are 3 subdivisions, the first of which is the demigods, or half-god, half-mortal Percy Jackson types. Next are the vestiges, deities which have fallen from power, whether they were sealed away after a war in heaven or have just lost too many followers. Vestiges are a ton of fun, and from what I can tell, almost omnipresent in the genre. to the point that I find it strange that they are only afforded like 3.5 lines in an insert in the DMG. I don't know if I have ever read a source book or an adventure module that didn't at least mention a vestige. The old god of so-and-so that no one remembers but the player party, or sometimes the big bad evil guy, have unearthed. My original adventures are no different. There is a vestige in like all of them. But yeah, if it sounds like it fits in your game, use a vestige. Players love that stuff. Moving on. The third subdivision of quasi-deity contains the Titans. The term is used to mean like 4 different things within the domain of D&D, but to be clear, we are not talking about the extra large giants, nor are we talking about Kronos or Hyperion or any of the other old Greek deities that preceded Zeus and friends. Using the DMG's lexicon, the Greek Titans would confusingly not be Titans, but would be vestiges, I think. In this case, at least, they're using the term Titan to mean any mythical deity which was brought about by divine will or substance. To avoid any more confusion, I'm just going to use the word Titan to mean any creature with a CR of 23 or higher that does not fit into an aforementioned category. I took a quick look through the bestiary and that mostly works. Figured I'd lean into the whole wastebasket tax idea. All of that said, we are going to be dealing almost exclusively with greater deities in this step, while maybe dipping a toe into lesser deities and vestiges. Everything else, all yours, have fun with it. So that's the divine ranking system and the deities within it. But now we're going to talk about pantheons. There are a million videos on pantheons for D&D, so I'm going to try and fail to keep this brief. The word pantheon gets used in a few different ways. In real-world history, the word pantheon is used to refer to the set of all gods belonging to a particular religion or tradition. Greek pantheon, the Norse pantheon, you know the type. Sort of like a band name. When I say the Beatles, you know I mean John, Paul, George, and Ringo, with maybe a Pete Best situation here and there. This is not how the term is used in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which gives us a convenient parenthetical definition. A loose grouping of deities not united by a single religion or philosophy. So in the DMG, a pantheon is more like a value meal. Here's a group of things that are very often found together, but there's all this other stuff too, so feel free to mix and match. And even if you get the value meal, which is, these 14 deities, all the other ones are still out there somewhere. And then in the online D&D vernacular, when people say the word pantheon, they often have a third meaning, which is to say, the gods of my world, or verbosely, all greater deities that live in, around, or among the higher planes in my campaign setting. These usages are assigned mostly based on function. It makes sense that in a history class, the term is used mostly as a shorthand. The blank pantheon, instead of having to say all gods associated with a particular culture's religion at some time period. This would be very useful if differentiating between or comparing the pantheons of different religions. Right? It's easier to say the Beatles than it is to say John, Paul, George, and Ringo's collaborative work between the years of 1962 and 1970. The usage of the term pantheon in the DMG, on the other hand, is indicative of its assumptions about religion and its implementation in Dungeons & Dragons. First and foremost, it facilitates the use of multiple pantheons within the same campaign setting, whether they are opposing forces, species exclusive, or cloistered due to isolation. There is also the idea of the greater D&D multiverse, which, as they define, is a vast array of planes and worlds where adventures happen. So, the world that you are creating exists within that greater multiverse. It is easy to understand why they put forth the ideas of pantheons the way they do. Because all DMs are contributing and building within this greater D&D multiverse, the McDonald's menu definition of pantheon doesn't exclude anything. To be clear, I think the greater multiverse is a really cool idea with some really fun use cases. So if you want to throw in some crossovers, a timeline intersection, and a few cameos, go for it. Its use is, at least in my experience and understanding, not incredibly common. Then again, considering the current trend in superhero films, maybe that'll change. But until then, I'll be using the third definition, or all gods in my campaign setting. My reasoning is, it's how I hear it used most often anyway, and it's how I use it most of the time. Second, assuming it's your first Pantheon, we should probably err on the side of simplicity. But don't worry, within this third definition there is plenty of room for mythic fantasy, the birth and death of gods, and some cosmic power struggle. I should also mention one of my preferences when it comes to religion in D&D, because it also influenced my perspective. There is a tradition in the genre to assign certain deities to certain species. Grumsh to the orcs, Loth to the drow, and so on. I never really liked the idea of species-exclusive gods and the implications that came along with them, so I never used them. Meaning I never needed to have separate pantheons for different cultures. What I would have is the same pantheon with different names for the deities and maybe a different distribution of their influence. But if you do want to include some species-exclusive deities, you could decide to make some alternate pantheons, or to just include them in a larger one. So now that we've defined our terms, let's get to the meat of the video, designing your pantheon. The DMG has a bunch of information on religious systems that I don't really use. It's worth a read to be sure, but mostly what it talks about is how mortals think about, interact with, and categorize the gods. This information is helpful, but most of it assumes that you use a vague bottom-up pantheon. And if these terms don't mean anything to you, it's because I made them up. I think this section of the DMG is an interesting read, but there are really only two questions that I consider vital to answer when designing your pantheon. Where do the gods come from, and are there any we don't know about? First, where do they come from? Are they natural-born forces as old as time itself? Or are they created when enough individuals come together and believe the same thing, or complete the right ritual? As I like to think about it, is your pantheon top-down or bottom-up? In a top-down pantheon, the gods exist regardless of what happens on the material plane. They are natural forces, born when the planar system was, and their influence is felt, accepted, or ignored by the mere mortals in your game. When a mortal aligns with a god, that deity's influence goes up, and when a god loses followers, its influence wanes. But the gods themselves do not change. Harkening back to our song metaphor, even if every mortal stopped singing along, in a top-down pantheon, the song would continue. Now, this kind of system isn't without wiggle room. I like to think of top-down pantheons sort of like the laws of physics. We don't know them all and have been very wrong about some of them, but they never change. Scientists can run multiple trials and replicate results. But when they analyze those results, it's possible that they disagree on an interpretation. As Dr. Sean Carroll said of quantum physics, we can establish how something works without knowing what it really means. So too are the scholars of your world bound by their mortal minds. All of the diagrams and models that you make for your players are not the letter of the law in your world. They are simply interpretations of a convoluted truth. So if it comes to pass that you need to add, subtract, or change a deity, it's not a retcon, it's a scientific breakthrough. This kind of system is my personal preference. It's stable, it's fun to build, and it makes it pretty easy to create a coherent and cogent planar system. Top-down pantheons, in my opinion, lend themselves to DMs who like intrigue and mystery. That is to say, flavors of fantasy where the plot revolves around some central truth that the characters need to discover. Games like this will also often include a set of cosmic rules, which are established early on. They can be fantastical to the point of absurd, but neither your players nor the bad guys can break them. Sort of along the lines of a hard versus soft magic system. But I'm not going to open that can of worms. I'm pretty meticulous when it comes to adventure writing, so this kind of system really works for me. Contrary to a top-down pantheon, in a bottom-up pantheon, the gods themselves are influenced by the will of mortals and other magical goings-on the material plane. Back to our song metaphor, in a bottom-up pantheon, the followers of a god are not singing along to an accompaniment. The chorus is the only instrument. A god with no influence left in the planar system can die, and if a new idea becomes popular enough, a god can be born. In a top-down pantheon, mortals simply assign names to the gods. In a bottom-up pantheon, they create them. This kind of pantheon makes it very easy to include vestiges, secret cults, and big bad evil guys who want to ascend to godhood. After all, it's only heresy if they fail, right? The second question to answer when designing your pantheon is how exhaustive is it? How many gods in your setting exist outside the understanding of the world's best religious scholars? In my parlance, I would probably ask whether it is a tight pantheon or a loose pantheon, but, and you might be noticing a theme here, the DMG uses those terms a little differently than I would. So, to avoid any confusion, I'll phrase the question like this. Is your pantheon vague or absolute? All of that meaning, if you made a bubble chart where each deity's influence is represented by its bubble's area, how much negative space is left? A vague pantheon has lots of negative space, or room for change. Gods can pretty easily be added in or expanded. Vague pantheons also tend to have a lot of satellite deities, or minor gods filling in the spaces between the big hitters. And in the case of a large ethics shift or an ancient ritual, there's plenty of room for a minor deity to balloon into a major one. This kind of system really lends itself to mythic fantasy. So if you like the idea of gallivanting through the planes, challenging gods, and becoming constellations, I might consider a vague pantheon. Alternatively, an absolute pantheon is exactly what it sounds like. There isn't any unclaimed territory, so to speak. Any change in influence is going to include the loss of influence from some other deity. These kinds of systems very often have two opposing factions, which bisects the planar system, putting it in constant tension. Good versus evil, light versus dark, Coke versus Pepsi, whatever. This is not the only way to institute an absolute pantheon, but it's an implementation I see kind of a lot. I know I mentioned that each type of pantheon indexes towards a particular flavor of fantasy, but I wanted to be clear that none of them are prohibitive. It might require a bit of detail massaging, but you can make any kind of adventure work in any kind of setting. Now that we have answered those two big questions, is our pantheon top-down or bottom-up, and is it vague or absolute, we can start filling in the organizer that we created for ourselves in step 0. If you skipped step 0, no worries. In short, we were mainly defining the two axes of this organizer. If you want, you can just toss in some random alignments and work from there. So, how will our organizer look once you've answered both questions? A top-down absolute pantheon will look like a spreadsheet. In each cell of your table, there will be one deity. This is the method I will be using for Praxis, mostly because it's the simplest. If anything ever changes in the pantheon, it's going to have to replace something else, or at least happen around the edges. A top-down vague pantheon will be similar, but there will be some spaces. When a new god crops up in your game, it isn't being created, it's being discovered. I have used this model very effectively, and it is probably my preferred pantheon structure. A bottom-up absolute pantheon will look a little more freeform. There might be some gods that take up more space than others, some might have small satellites, and when a new god shows up, you know exactly where it goes. You also know which other deity it must foist influence from to materialize. Finally, a bottom-up vague pantheon will look sort of like a heat map, with large blobs where the major deities are, smaller blobs for the more enigmatic ones, and plenty of space between them. Different systems will look different on this kind of organizer. Here are some examples of the religious systems put forth in the Dungeon Master's Guide. A loose pantheon is the D&D default. Tons of gods, they all exist, and if a new one is discovered, it's not the end of the multiverse. In a tight pantheon, a single religion embraces certain gods but rejects others. Dualism is good old-fashioned light versus dark, probably with some minor deities sprinkled in on either side. And in animism, everything has a divine spirit. Certain spirits are more powerful than others, often indexing towards the older ones. Once we have decided on what type of pantheon we are creating and put our fundamental forces on our organizer, if you chose to follow step 0, it's time to decide what actually goes in the blanks. It's time to create our gods. The first thing I would do, which you don't have to do, is to slap some archetypes on each blank that I think might fit there. What I mean is, if I had to assign a TV tropes page to each deity, like the Spock, the McCoy, or divested from pop culture, the Stoic, or the Passionate. Essentially one-word embodiments of certain ideals. If you get stuck, there are 10 million online D&D ideal tables. As we are filling in the deities of our pantheon, there are a few things we should consider. Each domain choice for clerics should be represented at least once on our pantheon as a suggested domain. On top of that, I would consider how lenient you want to be when your players are choosing their domains. I'm usually pretty generous, to the point that if a player can string together a couple of words about why a particular deity would be associated with a particular domain, I'm usually cool with it. If your setting has a more rigid religious structure, maybe you're a bit more strict about which cleric subclasses can be associated with which god. If I were in that situation though, I would probably let them do what they wanted, but let them know that their diversion from the rules means their character is an apostate. That sounds interesting. Finally, there are certain types of deities that always seem to be asked for or necessitated by players or adventure modules. Some that I would consider including are as follows. First is a god, usually lawful good, that just hates undead. God of the sun, god of order, the undertaker, whatever. This is usually a vehicle for paladins who just want to kill zombies. Next is a non-evil, usually chaotic deity associated with stealth or subterfuge. This serves the rogue with a heart of gold archetype. It can be discouraging if your chaotic good rogue is only ever able to enlist the help of evil deities. These characters aren't always religious, but if they are, this helps. In the past, I have made these deities have the archetypes of the conscientious objector or the righteous revolutionary. And finally, I would consider including at least one evil god that just loves making pacts with mortals. God of blood, god of death, you know the type. Especially if you plan on using adventure modules in your game. This type of agreement serves as a classic motivation for many villains. One lifetime of incredible power for one eternal soul. Next, we have to think about what your gods are actually called. The first option is to have true names for your gods, that every mortal knows them by. And if that's the case, you can just fill them in. And if you already have an idea of some deities you want to include, go ahead and slot those in. For Praxis, I want to name the gods using the languages of the ancient civilizations in my setting, which I haven't come up with yet. So I'm going to need some placeholders. If you are making a bottom-up pantheon, it's possible that you want to push this step back until after you already have your ancient civilizations. But I don't think that's strictly necessary. I don't want to get into a chicken versus egg digression, but it's all coming from the same place anyway. Now is a pretty good time to talk about aspects and epithets. What do I mean by that? I mean Thor, god of thunder, and Zeus, god of thunder. Most of the time when you say the name of a god, there should be a comma something after it. Why? Because names are hard to remember. Unless you are using the Greek Pantheon or maybe the Norse Pantheon, your players are not going to remember the name of every god in your setting. They just aren't. So hearing something evocative directly after the god's name can help your players associate an idea with that deity. Very often when I'm running, one of my players will forget the name of a deity but remember their aspect. We'll get a lot of situations like, we need to talk to God of Winter, what's her name? Most source books lean pretty heavily into aspects. Every god in their sample pantheon will be something like blank goddess of blank or blank god of blank. You can do this. It is expected as it is the norm. The pantheon I've used for the last 5 years or so is like this, and it works. My players love it. Another option is to use epithets, or titles or descriptors assigned to each deity. A good example are the demigods in Elden Ring. Godric the Grafted, Radon the Star Scourge. In a game replete with characters, many of which have very similar names, epithets can help the audience differentiate between them. The Grafted or the Star Scourge are not giving the full picture of the character, but they are giving the audience a general feeling. The Grafted, kinda icky. The Star Scourge. Is he a scourge of the stars, or is he using the stars to be a scourge of other things? Regardless, he's probably dangerous. See? Pretty close. In the case of Praxis, I'm going to diverge from the norm of aspects and create an animal zodiac, using epithets to associate my deities with things that my players can easily visualize. So-and-so the rat, and something-something the lion. Already, you can probably infer a few things about those deities, and I don't even know their names yet. So remember, whenever we say the name of a deity, there should probably be a comma something after it, at least for the first dozen or so times you say it at the table. If you're going by the DMG's step-by-step guide, this next topic doesn't come up until a little bit further down the road, so feel free to postpone it. But since we're already talking about primordial, big magic, beginning of the universe stuff, I figured we should at least mention planar systems, as well as some decisions regarding them. Dungeons & Dragons assumes several alternate planes of existence, or dimensions, to the central mortal world, the material plane. Altogether, they form a planar system. The term cosmology is used in this context to mean a particular modeling of these metaphysical regions. There are many of these dimensions, but the ones that we are concerned with at the moment are the outer planes, or the homes of the gods. How can something that is incorporeal have a home? Well, the DMG reminds us to be very metaphorical when talking about the outer planes, so I guess it's an incorporeal home. We're venturing into high weirdness territory here, so I'm just going to pull the ripcord and move on. The core books establish the relationship between the outer planes and greater deities as ambiguously adjacent. Once again, this ambiguity allows you to fill in the blanks with things that you like and that make sense to you. It also allows you to take the pantheon you just spent a bunch of time making and superimpose it onto pretty much any type of cosmology. There are several well-known and well-loved cosmologies of the planes of existence, notably the World Tree and the Great Wheel, both of which work perfectly well. And many of the individual planes within these cosmologies have an incredible depth of lore to them, stretching back way farther than the history of the hobby, like the 9 Hells, Isgard, and Hades. If you choose to use one of these planes, or an entire existing cosmology, there will be plenty of room for your Pantheon in and around it. But for the sake of the series, let's assume that you are designing all of these things yourself. Assuming you're doing it from scratch, the easiest and what I consider the most intuitive thing to do is to assign one plane to each deity. You don't have to do this, but it's pretty fast and you've already done most of the work. In this next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the original thought process I had when designing the planar system for my current campaign setting, some problems I ran into with that design, and how I solved those problems. The first time I set about designing a D&D campaign setting was not my first world building experience. So I went in incredibly confident that I could create a cosmology that reinforced the mythos of my Pantheon. And when I saw the Great Wheel cosmology with its axes of good versus evil and law versus chaos, I thought to myself, didn't I just do this? I had just organized my Pantheon into what I considered to be a pretty robust arrangement in regard to the alignment system. So I thought I'll just take the Great Wheel model and slap my Pantheon over it. Each god will get one outer plane, and that's my planar system. And I came up with something that looks like this. I thought it turned out pretty well. It has all of my deities, their aspects, alignments, and even if it's a little busy, my players thought it looked nice. But how useful was it? What is this organizer doing for me that a spreadsheet with all of this information wouldn't? Or, more aptly, if it arose that one of my players needed to venture to the plane of Amat, goddess of the sun, how would they go about doing that? Go through the plane of air and hang a left? I should be clear, I don't consider making this graphic a waste of time. I think my players would much prefer to look at something like this than a printout of a Google Sheet. I also don't mean that everything you spend time on for your game needs to be strictly functional. In fact, spending an immense amount of time on a resource or graphic and making it look pretty, only for it to end up not being that useful, is, in my experience, just being a dungeon master. So, welcome to the hobby, I guess. Fast forward to my players becoming higher level and becoming entangled in some interplanar stuff, I had trouble navigating between said planes. What you can do, and what I think is assumed by the core books, is that if you need to travel between planes and you don't have access to high-level conjuration magic, you need to find that place's planar gate. You want to go to the plane of Amat, goddess of the sun? Take the planar gate in Lonthur. Why is the planar gate in Lonthur? I don't know, because that's where it is. You can do this, and lean into the already ambiguous nature of planar systems in general. Could I come up with a compelling reason that the goddess of the sun's planar gate is in this particular town? Yeah, probably. Something about a folk hero, her valiant last stand, and a sea of 10,000 Quaggoth. But I prefer something a little bit more systematic. So I reorganized my planar system. I went back a step to my fundamental forces and went along the first broad lines I had drawn in my world building process, and came up with something like this. It's a little less busy, and if you want to get from one place to another, there is a clearly visible way to do so. Let's look at the same situation as earlier. If my players want to get to the plane of Amat, they're going to have to look for the gate to either the plane of fire or the plane of earth. I was pretty happy with the structure from the get-go, but mostly because of how helpful it was when writing adventure arcs. If my PCs needed to get to a particular place in the planar system, first they need to find the planar gate, journey through the elemental plane, a quick voyage through the astral sea, and they've reached their destination in the outer planes. That's 3 arcs right there with wildly different settings, which feeds into that dimension-hopping tone that you often want in an interplanar adventure. I'm not going to say that this is the best one out there or that it accomplishes anything that others don't, but I love this structure. Use it if you want, ignore it if you want, but I will be using something pretty similar to it for Praxis. Partly because I like it, and partly because it's pretty simple and straightforward. It bears mentioning that having a functional planar map is very helpful, but usually only at higher levels. If your players aren't level 11 at least, they probably aren't going to be hopping through any planar gates. That being said, if they are, don't let me stop you. So that's that. Decide whether you want your Pantheon to be top down or bottom up, and if it is going to be vague or absolute. Make a quick organizer and then fill in the blanks you've created. You can start with archetypes to give yourself some ideas, or if you've got plenty of those, you can go ahead and slot in aspects, epithets, or the gods' true names. Take a quick look at cosmologies and planar systems, decide whether you want to tackle that now or later, and we can call step 1 complete. Thanks for watching, everybody. That's the Pantheons, Deities, and Planar Systems video. I didn't love how the first practical video came out, so I've been messing around with the format a little bit, experimenting, and it's just been taking a little bit longer. But I do still like the idea of having a partner video structure where in one video I talk about the theory and then in the next video I do the theory. I think I've decided on something, so we'll see how it turns out. Other than that, if you want to support me, you can do all the normal stuff down here, or you can head over to the DM's Guild and check out Principles of Shamanism. See ya! LaRue, Lolth, and who's the Sahuagin guy? Sakola.